Carlos gripped the steering wheel. He was king of his rig. He loved the open road. The solitude of the open highway was his comfort zone. Tonight he was hauling a load from El Paso to Tucson. It was a familiar route, one he had driven countless times. But tonight something felt different. The air hung heavy and silent. It pressed down on the cab of his truck. The only sound was the low hum of the engine. It was a constant companion on these long hauls. Usually it was comforting, but tonight it felt ominous, like a drumbeat in the silence. The desert stretched out on either side of the highway, an endless sea of sand and scrub under the cloak of night. The road seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife, a solitary path in a vast, empty world. It was an endless expanse of darkness, where the horizon seemed to blur into the night sky. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the shadows that danced in the moonlight. The occasional scrub bush rushed by in the headlights, their twisted forms momentarily illuminated before being consumed by the darkness once more. They looked like clawing hands reaching for the truck, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The moon was a sliver in the sky, a thin crescent that provided little light. It hung there, distant and cold, offering no comfort to the lonely traveler. The stars, usually vibrant, seemed to dim and flicker, as if the desert night had stolen their brilliance. They were mere pinpricks in the vast, inky blackness. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. The desert night was cold, but this was different. It was a feeling that gnawed at him, a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He wasn't a superstitious man. He had driven this route countless times, seen all manner of strange things in the dead of night. But tonight felt different. He had seen a lot on these night drives. The desert had its own way of playing tricks on the mind, with shadows that seemed to move and sounds that came from nowhere. But tonight, there was a prickling on the back of his neck. Something wasn't right. It was as if the desert itself was watching him, waiting for something. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white in the dim light. It was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind, he repeated to himself. The vast emptiness of the desert could do that, make a man see things that weren't there. He turned up the radio, hoping to catch some music, some sign of life. The familiar tunes would be a welcome distraction from the oppressive silence. All he got was static. The white noise filled the cab, a stark reminder of just how alone he was out here. He sighed, turning the dial in vain, searching for a signal that never came. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had a long way to go, and the night was far from over. The desert stretched out before him, an endless expanse of darkness and uncertainty. The road ahead was long and lonely, but he had no choice but to keep going. The desert night was unforgiving, but Carlos was determined to make it through. The headlights cut through the darkness, a small beacon of light in an otherwise impenetrable night. They guided him forward 1 mile at a time. In the vastness of the desert, the truck was a solitary figure, moving steadily through the night. Carlos knew he had to stay focused, keep his wits about him. The desert was a place of mystery and danger, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. With a final glance at the road ahead, Carlos steeled himself for the journey. The desert night was long, but he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. As the truck disappeared into the distance, the desert night closed in once more, a silent, watchful presence. Carlos drove on, a lone traveler in a world of shadows. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Hours crawled by. The silence started to get to him. The static on the radio seemed to grow louder. It was an irritating buzz that filled the cab. He reached to change the channel. That's when he saw her. A figure stood on the side of the road. A woman, dressed in white. Carlos blinked, unsure of what he was seeing. He slowed the truck, peering out into the darkness. The woman remained motionless. She was just standing there, her back to him, facing the empty desert. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't unusual to see people stranded on this road, but something about this woman seemed off. The way she stood so still, so alone. He pulled his truck over to the shoulder a little way ahead of her. He flipped on his hazard lights and rolled down the window. "Hey there!" he called out, his voice rough in the quiet air. "Need some help?" The woman didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge his presence. Carlos hesitated. He felt a growing sense of unease. He considered pulling away, but something compelled him to try again.
He took a deep breath. "My name's Carlos. I'm headed towards Tucson." The night was dark and the road ahead seemed endless. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence of the night. Carlos had been driving for hours and fatigue was beginning to set in. He glanced at the empty seat beside him, feeling the weight of loneliness. "You can hop in and I'll give you a ride to the next town if you need it." He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe it was the need for some company or just the eerie feeling that he wasn't truly alone. The road was deserted and he hadn't seen another vehicle for miles.
Silence. The woman remained motionless. She stood there, like a statue, her white dress glowing faintly in the dim light of the truck's headlights. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. Who was she? Why was she standing there in the middle of nowhere? But then, through the static on the radio, Carlos thought he heard a voice. It was barely audible, almost drowned out by the static, but it was there. A soft, whispering voice that sent shivers down his spine. A whisper, faint and chilling. He strained to hear it, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice seemed to be calling out to him, pleading, almost desperate.
"Don't leave me." The words were clear now, and they echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread.
Carlos's blood ran cold. He had never felt such fear before. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. He looked around, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. He looked at the woman. She hadn't moved. She was still standing there, as if frozen in time. Her eyes seemed to be staring right at him, piercing through the darkness. He glanced back at the radio. The static was gone. The voice had disappeared, leaving behind an unsettling silence, replaced by an eerie silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, like something is lurking just out of sight. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. Maybe he was just tired and his mind was playing tricks on him. But the fear was real, and it was growing with each passing second. The isolation playing tricks on his mind. The vast emptiness of the desert, the endless stretch of road, it all seemed to close in on him, suffocating him. But deep down, he knew better. Something was very wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that something or someone was out there, watching him, waiting. The night was far from over, and Carlos knew that whatever was happening, it was just the beginning. He slammed the truck into gear and sped off. The woman vanished from his rearview mirror. He kept his eyes glued to the road, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned the radio up, desperate for any sound to break the terrifying silence. But all he heard was the static again, louder and more insistent.
He glanced at his side mirror. His blood ran cold. The woman in white stood right beside his truck, her face pale and gaunt in the moonlight, eyes hollow and dark. He slammed on the gas, pushing the truck faster and faster.
He didn't slow down until he saw the lights of a gas station in the distance. It was a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. He pulled into the gas station, his hands shaking. He threw the truck into park and jumped out, his heart still racing.
He went inside, desperate for the comfort of another human presence. The warmth of the fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee were a relief. He glanced back at his truck. She wasn't there. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on him. He tried to calm his nerves, but the unease gnawed at him relentlessly. Each breath felt like a struggle, a battle against the rising tide of panic. He bought a cup of coffee, hoping the familiar routine would ground him. The warmth of the cup in his hands was a small comfort, a fleeting distraction from the turmoil within. He sat down, the aroma of the coffee mingling with the stale air of the gas station. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, to make sense of the inexplicable. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, he thought, a fleeting shadow, a figment of his tired imagination. But the memory of the sight lingered, refusing to be dismissed. His mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. A figment of his tired imagination, he repeated to himself, trying to convince his own senses, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. It clung to him like a shadow, a constant reminder of the unknown.
He finished his coffee, the last sip leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. The unease had not dissipated. If anything, it had grown stronger. He decided to use the restroom, hoping a splash of cold water might clear his head. The fluorescent lights flickered as he walked, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As he was washing his hands, the cold water felt like a jolt to his system. He splashed his face, trying to wash away the lingering fear. He glanced up at the mirror. his reflection staring back at him with wide, anxious eyes. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer. His breath caught in his throat as he saw something move behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Behind him, reflected in the mirror, stood the woman in white. Her presence was unmistakable, her figure ghostly and ethereal. She stood there, silent and still, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably. Her face was inches from his, her breath cold against his skin. He could see every detail of her pale, haunting features. Her eyes locked on his with a chilling intensity, as if she could see into the very depths of his soul. He felt paralyzed, unable to move or look away.
He whirled around, but there was no one there. He was alone. He stumbled out of the restroom, his heart pounding. He rushed out of the gas station and back to his truck. He had to get out of there.
As he drove away, he saw her one last time, standing on the side of the road, bathed in the red glow of his taillights. She watched him go, her face a mask of sadness and despair. Carlos never stopped on that highway again. He couldn't. The memory of that night, of the woman in white, haunted him. He could still hear her whisper in the static of his radio. He could still feel her chilling presence beside him in the truck.
He knew he would never be free of her. She was a part of him now, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks on the edge of reality.
He tells his story now, a cautionary tale to anyone who will listen.
Beware the woman on the highway, he warns them. Don't stop for her. Don't look at her. Just keep driving. And pray she doesn't choose you. For she is lost and she is searching, and she will not rest until she finds her way home.